the latest escalation between the United States and Russia, and with the tanker. And how do you see this sort of escalation between the two superpowers after that, movement on the part of the Trump administration in Venezuela, and right now is some sort of confrontation between the two superpowers, which could escalate, by the way. We know that the Russian part is somehow patient, but how far that would go on the part of the Russians, and how do you see the situation?
Well, that's the real question: is how much longer will Russian patience continue to pave the way, and why is the Trump administration taking this risk, especially now? I mean, we're meeting. They just had this meeting in Paris with, that Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner went to. They're trying to come up with some sort of an agreeable peace terms that everybody can agree to. The reason why Witkoff and Kushner are there because they spend a lot of time with Russia, so they're ostensibly know what the Russian side is. So maybe they can move the two sides closer together so that we can have better relations. When Trump meets with Putin, he says the same thing on the phone or whenever or in person, as in Anchorage, that they want to move past this war, that they want to have good, enduring relations. That seems to be mutual. But then you have this issue here. Why are we moving to take a tanker here that belongs to Russia when we have already taken the Venezuela out of the equation? I mean, that should seem to have made that whole moot. But you see, one of the problems that I think is being created here that I worry a lot about is that Trump is facing a situation to where he has no constraints to using military. He doesn't have it domestically. He doesn't have it. I'm talking public relations. He doesn't have it with the Constitution, the 1973 War Powers Act, or the separation of powers that written into the Constitution with Congress don't exist. So he has literally been able to do everything he wants with these attacks on these alleged drug boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific Seas. He just takes them out, kills people, even though it completely violates any kind of rule, any kind of law, international or American. There is no justification and authorization to just go and wantonly kill people suspected of running drugs, etc. He's attacked in a foreign country in Iran. He's done it in Nigeria. He's done it in parts of Iraq. He's done it, of course, in the Red Sea, in Yemen, and now in Venezuela, and is threatening to do it in other places. And of all places, Greenland may also be on the target list. What you see is somebody with no constraints and no reduction. And now then you see the risk that he keeps taking grow. And now then we have this one here, which would seem to be contradictory to what American national interest even is, which is having a good relation with Russia, trying to bring that war to an end with Ukraine. And then you're taking a risk here that you could actually escalate things. To me, this doesn't make any sense. Even if you take morality out of it, I don't understand what the intent is here and why we would be doing something like this.
Colonel, what's the end game in Venezuela? What is the end game by kidnapping the president of Venezuela, and what sort of change comes to Venezuela?
Well, I can tell you what the end game isn't. It is not to make America safe. It is not to prevent drug deaths in the United States. Those are all canards, and they're very thinly held even at that. It has nothing to do with that. In fact, when you look at the actual where the illegal drugs that do kill a lot of Americans come in, it's usually through legal ports of entry. It's smuggled in through other ways. Hardly any of it comes in through off the shore and onto the land or something else where like these speedboats. Those speedboats we've hit don't even reach America. They can't get there. And most of the drugs that are made in Venezuela, as is common knowledge now, go to Europe, not to the United States. There's a bunch of other places that are way higher on the list, United States. So that's all fake. So what is the play here? Seems to be as simple, and this is based on what Stephen Miller has been saying, which actually does line up with what we've been doing. We wanted political control of the country of Venezuela so that nobody, and that means primarily Russia and China, get to do anything in our hemisphere that we don't authorize and that we don't control. And then, of course, it's the classic thing of the oil, which Trump said like 100 times during his press conference and several other things after this military operation. So the end game appears to be I want political control of the country of Venezuela so that they'll do what I tell them to do, and physical control of the oil supply so that we can enrich ourselves. That's about as naked of an aggression as you can get, and accurate.
Do you see the importance of national security strategy of the United States under the Trump administration somehow being considered for this operation in Venezuela?
Listen, I honestly, I know that they just released just a month or two ago this national security strategy. I didn't think then, and I definitely don't think now, that it has anything to do with national security. It's just something that we put out to let people talk about and to make it look like we have some idea. I think the Trump administration is as transactional as it appears. He just wants to do what he wants to do today. He doesn't think about how it's going to be later on. He may think, well, it would be great to have Venezuela because then that gives me control, and brings everybody else into fear, whether that be Colombia or Mexico, or for some reason we just have this obsession with tiny Cuba that poses no threat to anyone. That's one of the things that proves this is not about national security, because they pose no security threat to us. You can extend that into Greenland. This whole ridiculous thing about talking about, which Stephen Miller is just, I mean, a rabid about, and obsessive about, and went on CNN a couple of days ago and just ranted at length on this topic here. And they keep saying, and Trump himself says several times, we got to have Greenland. We have it for our national security. Well, that's also obviously at face value ridiculous and absurd, and no truth to it whatsoever. We've never had Greenland, and our security has never been at threat. It is not at risk now, and it's not going to become at risk because we don't do something we don't have and never have had. But we have had a military contingent on the on Greenland that continues on. That's never changed. So we already had some there, and if we even wanted more, Nima, we could have cooperated with Denmark and maybe said, "Wait, we want more access, or we want to do this. We want to add another base." They probably would have done that. They may not have liked it, but they probably would have done it. But we didn't even try that route because we don't care about that. The national security strategy of the United States right now is not there. It doesn't exist. There is the Trump doctrine, which is even different than what I think Stephen Miller said on that CNN interview, which is really, when you look at it with the actions, it is, I will take what I want, when I want, and you won't do anything about it. And if you do, I'll kill you. That is the Trump doctrine right now. It's whatever I see, I will take it until I get bored, and then I'll move on to something else. And that's what we've seen for the first 12 months, nearly 12 months of his term here. And God only knows what the next 3 years are going to bring.
Carl, do you see the sort of chaos that is happening in Venezuela somehow spreading all throughout the Latin America, in Cuba and
Well, I
Colombia?
mean, by intention, it's going to spread into Cuba because that's apparently an objective of the United States. We want to cause that. We want to harm Cuba. We want to politically destroy them with economic means. And unlike what we tried to do with Russia, we may be able to succeed there. And look, I went to Cuba on a religious mission. I think 2015, 2016, somewhere around there. And I'm telling you, the people there are so poor. They're a threat to literally no one. They struggle to keep the lights on. Part of the problem is this communist government is incompetent, or very so corrupt, and they're just not very effective. We don't need to do anything to them. In fact, I don't see any reason in this modern age why we shouldn't lift all these sanctions, just do business with them, and just treat them like another country. I mean, we kind of do that with China, communist China, who actually has an effective military, who has an effective government. Communists, we don't hesitate to do business with them. Why should we hesitate to do the same thing to Cuba? It literally makes no sense at all unless you recognize that there are just those in the United States that have an obsession with destroying Cuba for things that happened in the past decades, and the actual reality is irrelevant. It's all about this anger and historical grievances, and it doesn't have anything to do with reality or logic. It just has to do with emotion. And right now, that's ruling the day. That's part of the Trump doctrine. Emotion can be expressed, even if it means killing a bunch of people or destroying the government of people, with no concern. Let's be clear on this: no concern about what would happen to the people of Cuba if the government does fall. And that's again part and parcel, which is a really frightening thing for an American right now, to when you see where the government is putting its priorities.
Yeah, one of the major problems with, in the eyes of the Latin America countries like Brazil, and even the case of Venezuela, they're ready to talk with the United States. They're ready to do whatever, make a deal with the United States. But the United States doesn't care about these people. Even with the president of Brazil, Donald Trump doesn't care about Lula. He's trying to interfere in the domestic policy in Brazil instead of making new deal, making negotiations with the government, the current government in Brazil. And we saw it in Venezuela happening.
Well,
Maduro
we did.
was telling
And
us peace, 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 and after.
and of course, you saw what did work in Argentina with Milieu. He actually just said, "Hey, whatever you want, I'm all in," and he just remained and gave fealty to Trump. That's what Trump wants, and so that worked for him. As long as you applaud Trump and fall at his feet, then you can have success, and that's what Trump is looking for. He does not want to just make a deal. And we'll look at Brazil because Brazil has a strong leader. He doesn't want to have a strong leader there that has his own independent course and he'll make a deal where it makes sense to his country. He wants someone who's going to have fealty. And so that's why he didn't listen to Nicolas Maduro, because he didn't want to leave him in charge, even though he practically offered him the keys to the country, and why he apparently doesn't want to do anything with Lula or anybody else out there. And certainly you can add Pedro to that list in Colombia. Now that we got a war of words there too. And so President Trump doesn't want to do that because he's not willing to bow the knee to Trump. That's what we're looking for: subservience and submission. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're in the crosshairs.
Carl, we had two major escalation against Russia since Donald Trump took power in the United States. One of them was the attack on nuclear bombers in Russia. The other one was before the operation in Venezuela, the attack on Putin's residence in Russia. And uh, with what's going on between the United States and Russia, do you think that Russia is getting to the point? What is the point of negotiating with the United States if they're trying to assassinate? Because they have handed, the evidence that shows they wanted to attack. The main objective was the Russian president. And what is your assessment? On one
Yeah.
side, you see Donald Trump talking, see, I want to make a deal with Vladimir Putin. And JD Vance, I would say that is in the same sort of mindset. On the other hand, you see behind the scene CIA and all of these intelligence cooperating and helping the regime in Kiev to do whatever they want.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I'm reluctant to say that it was the United States that either approved or even helped with that attack, the alleged attack on Putin's residence in Novgorod. I don't know for sure that happened. We have to just trust that the Russians said this; they mean it. We also know we have to take everything with a grain of salt, because everybody will use misinformation or deception when it works in their favor. Maybe they claimed it. Maybe it happened. I don't know. If it did happen, I would be more likely to think that this was a Ukrainian operation that probably Trump knew nothing about, because I don't see anything at all that we would gain from that. I think a lot we would lose, because I'm just telling you, if that actually happened the way it was portrayed, and if it had been successful, no matter who charged it, who authorized it, it would be profoundly bad for Ukraine and profoundly bad for the Western world and the United States also, because I'm promising you, anyone that would follow up Putin would be profoundly, much, much more antagonistic toward the West and much more willing to use force across the board, and the chances of conflict would go way up. Just imagine in the United States if anybody, for any reason, anywhere, assassinated the president of the United States, and we were able to draw it to certain. The likelihood of tactical nuclear weapons would just be through the roof, and it would nearly be a miracle if we didn't do so. But we would definitely have a huge response. Look what happened in 9/11 on a conventional level. That gives you a pretty good idea. And so if this had succeeded, then Russia would be in a position to do that, and the handcuffs would have come off. So I don't think that Trump would have done that. We have the problem with this tanker here you're talking about. That's a little bit more difficult to square, but it is a smaller issue, so it's not quite up to the same level here. But the bottom line is, because there is no actual strategy, because we don't actually have a coherent worldview that we want to accomplish and to make this fit inside of, then you have episodic issues, and that's what we're seeing here with Russia. It depends on what day of the week it is. And listen, we cannot rule out, just like I can't rule out that either President Trump or whoever may have been behind this issue here you're talking about with the alleged attack on Russia. We also cannot rule out that Trump is suffering significant degradation in his cognitive capabilities. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that is. And this irrational action with, on the one hand, talking about Putin like he's your best pal or something, and you're, talking about how great he is and throwing out the red carpet and the airplane flyovers and all that at Anchorage, and then saying he's really angry at him, and then saying, no, I think we want to reach a deal, and I can work with, you know what I mean? It's all over the map. So even within Trump himself, forget about the administration, you just have all kinds of things all over the map, and that could be evidence of cognitive decline. That, different than what we saw in Biden. Biden had cognitive decline, but it was a different type that was a lot easier to see, and just, he would go blank and, stare, could start mumbling. That's one kind. But a different kind is where you appear to have your faculties, but your decision making is deeply impaired. And based on what we see, we can't rule that out. Now, until somebody does an investigation, a medical and a psychological investigation, and then releases the information, we can't say for sure. But I can just tell you that's something that we need to keep on the table.
Yeah. How did you find the reaction of Europe in terms of what has happened in Venezuela, considering the Trump's new move on Greenland? Because if you are against what is happening, considering Greenland, you have to address what has happened in Venezuela. You cannot be, somehow have double standards.
Well, you can, and we do it on an hourly basis here in the Western world. And that includes Europe as much as the United States. Almost, it's a battle to see who can be the most inconsistent. So you can have double standards. We do it on a daily basis. You shouldn't have double standards. There should be one standard, and in a sense, that's actually a problem, because we saw Stephen Miller on CNN just a couple of days ago really lay out a pretty dark vision for what he believes is the Trump doctrine. And he's talked about the Monroe Doctrine, but basically he said that's no longer the case, because the actual Monroe Doctrine, by the way, said that we wanted to protect our hemisphere from external people coming in to try and manipulate countries, to protect the Western Hemisphere, not to, as Miller has changed it, to now then the new Monroe Doctrine, which Trump monikered on himself apparently, is to exploit the whole hemisphere for the benefit of the United States. And we decide who can stay in power, who can't. We will punish, and that means kill anybody who stands in our way. And no outside powers, read China and Russia, can have any influence in it. You saw Marco Rubio drive that point home as well. So when you see that in the hemisphere, and you see that that's the mentality and the priorities put behind any actions that we take, and then you see the eyes drift off not just to our hemisphere, but then to the Middle East. And we're talking again about maybe we're going to go back after Iran again. We may have to, quote, knock them down again, as Trump said. And, that came right on the heels of Netanyahu being here. So everybody's wondering, are we going to, quote, finish the job there? That's on the table. And then we're going to go from the Middle East into Europe and to take Greenland. And as I said a second ago, this canard that we need it for our national security is absurd at face value. Any kind of analysis shows that there's no truth to that at all. And it also says, look, a lot of these, when Trump claims that, oh, well, I see Russian and Chinese ships. Yeah, no kidding. It's international waters 12 miles off the coast. They're authorized to do that. The laws, the international law, and just the laws of the sea allow that. That's what we allegedly have these freedom of navigation operations in the Taiwan Strait, for example, of saying, hey, we want to keep international waterways open so that nobody can say that you can't go in here. And we're going to keep that open, except up here, I guess. And now we don't want anybody that we don't like there. So you see, it's not even just the Monroe or the Monroe Doctrine. It's not just our hemisphere. President Trump is laying the foundation and making claims that it's the world. It's our hemisphere. It's the Middle East. It's apparently in the South Pacific, South China Seas area, and in Europe. Where is off limits right now? The Arctic. We want to control all this. And I'm just telling you, this is the kind of recipe that will lead to self-immolation, self-destruction. We don't have the power. Let me just bluntly say, we don't have the military power to make good on all of these checks he's writing and thinking that we can do this, because we had a pretty successful tactical operation to snatch and grab a leader of a country, which was, just on the surface of it, really successful. But I'm telling you, that is radically different than fighting a conflict and a war against anybody who can fight back. And that means, of course, it means China and Russia. We couldn't fight them and win at all. I don't know that if we get into an actual war with Iran, where that means where Iran makes good on what it claimed this time. They made some similar claims the first time and didn't follow through. But now then they're saying if there's another attack, all of your bases throughout the Middle East become targets. And they have the wherewithal with their offensive missiles to penetrate our air defenses and can cause tremendous damage if we get into it. And if we get into a war there, and if anybody else finally stands up to us, we don't have the wherewithal to have a sustained operation of any type. I mean, our army's 400 and some odd thousand for the entire globe that we have. It's ridiculous, but Trump doesn't seem to be aware of that. So you overextend, and then you start having to where a number of different actors say, you know what? I don't care how big and powerful you are. I don't care that you could probably squash us like a bug. I'm going to fight against you anyway. And then all of a sudden, people may realize, hang on, they're not quite as good as they think they are, not quite as good as they're saying. This is a recipe to find out. And we don't need to do that because that would be bad for the world, but it would definitely be bad for the United States.